Okay, welcome to this panel. This panel, we're gonna talk about the economic situation after the very serious external impact. My name is Dasen Chu. I'm a research fellow and economic forecaster of the Taiwan Institute of Economic Research. And at such a difficult time, it is actually very difficult to come up with a very reliable or accountable prediction. Okay, sometimes prediction has become guessing. For example, like by referring to international forecasting agencies, we know that the world economic growth of this year compared with the same period last year will decline by from 4 to 6%. And also certain institutes believe that Taiwan's economy will drop by 4% compared with last year. And frankly, I have no idea how they come up with those numbers. But however, for your information, Taiwan has been doing, I think, okay, with respect to such a very serious economic impact. For example, the first half of Taiwan's economic growth so far would standing at a positive growth rate, 0.78%. Okay, put it on international comparison, I think it's good enough. Okay, and this session, because of this very serious external impact, we're gonna talk about what the existing supply value chain will look like. What would be the new economic order in the post-COVID-19 era? We have four very outstanding panelists. Let me invite them to say hi to the audience here. Professor Evan Falkenbaum, can you hear me? Yes, please say hi to the audience.
Hi, everybody. Good morning to everyone in Taipei. Good evening from Chicago. Sorry not to be with you. I've been stuck in the same apartment for 6 months, jealous of your COVID successes. But in any case, it's a pleasure to be on the panel, and I look forward to the conversation.
Okay, welcome. And our second panelist, by referring to the agenda, is Professor Nobukazu Kanehara Sensei. Please say hi to the audience.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, Evan. Glad to be here. Happy to discuss with you about the important issue, Asian economic situation, maybe U.S.-American technology competition. Happy to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
Welcome, Sensei. The next presenter, Professor Jong Koo-yoon. Professor Jong.
Hello, greetings from Seoul, Korea. We had a series of typhoons this month, but today is a beautiful day, and I am very happy to join in this very meaningful dialogue today.
Welcome, Professor Jong. Last but certainly not least, presenter will be Director Ho-Suk Lee Makiyama. Director, welcome.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you today. I wish I was in Taiwan.
Okay. I know that Director Ho-Suk has been to Taiwan several times, right? So after the pandemic, probably you're very welcome to come back. And now, without further ado, let me invite our first presenter, Professor Evan Falkenbaum, who is the Vice President for Studies, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Professor Falkenbaum, you have at most 15 minutes. The floor is yours.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Darson, and thanks again to everybody. I'm sorry I can't be there. I look forward to the post-pandemic future where we can all gather in Taipei again. Before I get into it, let me first congratulate the government. I know the last panel focused on trade, but I do want to congratulate the government on the pork and beef decision, which I hope will now ease the way to negotiation of a bilateral trade agreement with the United States. Now, the title of this panel, as you've just said, includes the phrase economic security, which is precisely, I think, the right focus at a time of market turbulence, economic uncertainty, and technological change. And to me, at least, economic security really has two components. First, it means having the right economy, not just for right now, but to compete 10 to 20 years from now. And then second, it means by necessity, therefore, having an economy that is both innovative, but also adaptive to change. And so it seems to me the good news for Taiwan in particular is that it has an economy that has been built on a foundation of innovation since at least the 1970s. But the tougher news is that technology and industry are changing much more rapidly than, in my view, Taiwan and many others for that matter have kept sufficient pace. And so that's really what I want to talk about, steps and partnerships to assure Taiwan's innovation future. Now, you may or may not know, but earlier this year, I published a big report at Carnegie with that title, Assuring Taiwan's Innovation Future, that spoke to some of those challenges. And so what I want to do is briefly address this in three very quick bites, because I'm mindful of the time. So first, I just want to review Taiwan's innovation ecosystem and what made it unique and successful. But then also the risks that I think have arisen in recent years to its innovation competitiveness. Second, I want to flag for you 5 specific challenges that I view as the most acute. And then finally, I'm going to throw out a few modest ideas with a focus on international partnerships, not least with the United States, my own country. That report I mentioned had about 50 or 60 of these ideas. I'm just going to do about 7 that I think are worth highlighting. And so let me just take it in 3 bites, and hopefully that'll give us some things to chew on. All right, first on the legacy. Now, you all know better than I do. You're all sitting in Taiwan, but Taiwan's ecosystem, from my vantage point, had 3 very distinctive advantages that functioned almost like 3 legs of a stool. The first was essentially government competition policy associated with people like KT Lee, for example, which fashioned a much more flexible and decentralized ecosystem than was the case, frankly, sorry, Nobu, in Japan or in South Korea historically. So in Taiwan, it was not called industrial policy per se, but the things that we associate with the foundation of ITRI, with the first generation of startups in Taiwan, with the creation of an indigenous venture capital industry, for example, all of that really owes a lot to government competition policy and the kind of decisions that were made at that point in time. Now, second is what I would call aggressive internationalization, and especially the unique links that cropped up in the 1970s and into the 1980s between Taiwan and Silicon Valley. And this is what people like Annalise Saxenian at UC Berkeley have called brain circulation, where so many from Taiwan landed in Silicon Valley and then went back from California to Taiwan to establish the ecosystem there, but importantly, while maintaining very fundamental links to the Valley and to technology and innovation in the United States. All right, and third, there was leveraging not just quality and cost, but a capability to innovate independently, manifest especially, of course, in the chip fab associated with TSMC as an alternative to vertical integration. Now, I tell you all that because it's a symbol and emblematic of Taiwan's successes. But I think, to be quite frank, and I hope we'll talk about this, that Taiwan now faces some accumulating risks to the successful model. The first is what I would call a persistent lack of internationalization in Taiwan's new startup scene, despite some really innovative accelerators like the Startup Stadium, for example, beyond these world-class legacy sectors like semiconductors. The data on that is, in fact, pretty sobering. For example, there's a Zhonghua Institution for Economic Research report that shows that less than 1% of R&D in Taiwan is funded by foreign sources. More than 70% of startup revenue, according to a PwC survey from 2018, came from the domestic market in Taiwan. And so it's imperative, in my view, to restore and nurture some of those once very aggressive international linkages to the Valley and beyond. Now, second is technological change, as I said, because there's been a transition in Silicon Valley and elsewhere from hardware, which is Taiwan's really special comparative advantage, to software and also software-hardware integration. And these things really define some of the core emerging technology industries, from AI-enabled applications to security at the edge. And then third, there are the political challenges from Beijing that we all know very well. One is the constricting of Taiwan's international space, which has downward effects in supply chains and investment opportunities. Another is the fostering by mainland China of its own industrial base, which has led, among other things, to the poaching of engineering talent from Taiwan to the other side of the strait. And third, there is the way in which multinationals and startups, not least here in the United States, have transitioned from partnerships in Taiwan to partnerships in mainland China, including around the rather unique hardware ecosystem in Shenzhen. So that's my first bite. In a nutshell, Taiwan's innovation ecosystem faces some new risks. The government's doing some terrific things with the 5+2 Innovative Industries Plan, with the Asian Silicon Valley Project, but ultimately, building on those two initiatives, the solution is going to be twofold: getting back to basics by fostering a next generation of engineering talent, especially in emerging fields like data science and computer science. And then second, to re-energize international partnerships in these new fields. All right, so that brings me to the second bite. I want to highlight 5 specific challenges that get at some of these reorientation. And I think this is really where international partnerships, including with the United States, but also others, really ought to be directed. I'm not going to dig very deeply, but you can read this Carnegie report I mentioned if you want to have a look at some of the data. It seems to me that there are 5 major issues that pose acute challenges now to Taiwan today. The first is to vastly expand and refocus the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics talent and human capital pool, where Taiwan, like many other economies, faces obstacles in its effort to assure a robust and growing STEM talent pool because there's a lot of international competition, including from China. Second is the problem of scale, because it can be difficult to scale industries and business models when you have a domestic market of just 24 million. Third is the challenge of moving beyond hardware. And to put that as bluntly as I can for you, I think Taiwan, frankly, has yet to transition fully from a hardware-dominant ecosystem to greater emphasis, not just on software, but especially on hardware-software integration. So if you think of an industry, for instance, like drones, where a Chinese company, DJI, is now the dominant player, the competitive advantage begins with hardware, but really has become distinctive because the integration of software and hardware into the drone systems. So that's going to be particularly important. Fourth is to assure that more of the value added from technology supply chain stays in Taiwan itself, where too little of the value added today within technology-related supply chains resides. And last is the need for policy enhancements to adapt government technology and education policies to enhance competitiveness in some of these emerging fields that I mentioned. Now, I want to put particular emphasis on the first of these, which is the STEM talent pool, because it implicates international partnerships that I think have begun to atrophy, and where Americans and Taiwanese really need to reinvigorate this as public-private partnership. Taiwan needs innovators with specialized skills in math, statistics, computer science, and data science, not just legacy fields like electrical and mechanical engineering, because those are the skills that are at the heart of emerging fields like machine learning, AI, cybersecurity. And if you look at the data, there are some gaps and shortfalls. I'll just give you one big bite at that. From 2007 to 2014, the number of science and engineering first university degrees in Taiwan declined by nearly 10,000, from about 92,000 to 83,000, even though the total number of engineering graduates actually rose very sharply compared to, say, the 1990s. But the important thing is that within that talent pool, the number of computer scientists and specialists in math, statistics, and the physical and biological scientists has not expanded. And so that means that at a time of this rapid technological change that I described, when Taiwan is facing so much competition, concentrating the talent pool into legacy fields like semiconductors is not in the long-term interest of a more competitive economy 20 years down the road. So Taiwan is, in my view, underinvested in emerging areas such as computer and data science, for example. All right, that brings me to my third and final point. Again, mindful of the time, and we can dig in on any of this if you want, which is partnerships. Now, a related challenge, and I say this particularly as an American, is that the number of Taiwan students going to the United States has trended downward over the last 20 years at every educational level, if you dig into the data. And more of these students, especially those with the most experience, are actually choosing to stay in the United States. So from 2004 to 7, roughly 65% of Taiwan origin US educated PhDs in science and engineering plan to stay in the United States. By 2015, that number, which I personally think is staggeringly high, had risen to 75% in surveys, which means that about 3 out of every 4 Taiwan PhDs in an American educational institution stays here in my country. And if you go back to what I said about brain circulation in this dynamic trans-Pacific ecosystem, that in my view is not a good trend. Now, the report I mentioned earlier has a lot of recommendations, particularly around US-Taiwan partnerships, but also for Kanehara-san, some things about Taiwan-Japan partnerships and US-Taiwan-Japan partnerships. But I want to flag a few just by way of discussion. First, I know we're in a pandemic and we're living in a world of restricted entry, but easing work and visa market entry policies in a post-pandemic environment, I think is going to be particularly important to Taiwan's competitiveness. These would encourage global startups, not just the big players like Google and Microsoft that have doubled and tripled down on their Taiwan investments recently, to set up shop in Taiwan. Second, supporting industry-led mentorship programs. For example, Wistrun, which is an ICT ODM with about 80,000 global employees, you may know, has promoted a program to bring foreign artificial intelligence experts to Taiwan to serve as mentors in residence. AI mentoring programs, in my view, could be scaled through public-private partnerships, but then replicated in other areas like quantum computing, cybersecurity, Internet of Things, biotechnology, data sciences, and so on. Third, expanding the G-Asia Pass scheme, which you may know is a digital entrepreneurship card that gives equal national treatment to like-minded economies, that promotes freer talent flow. And I know at this forum, from hearing about the previous sessions, there's been a lot of emphasis on like-minded economies. Fourth, establishing a Trans-Pacific US-Taiwan advisory panel encompassing domestic technology leaders in Taiwan, representatives of US firms doing R&D in Taiwan, the venture capital industries on both sides of the Pacific, and university leaders to redress some of the things I talked about before. Fifth, becoming a trusted hub, trusted vendor, trusted tester, and trusted conduit. For example, by leveraging the double threat of high quality data and comparatively open access to data that you enjoy in Taiwan for everything from clinical trials for pharmaceuticals to cybersecurity. And that has some resonance for biotech and pharma after COVID, to go back to the title of the panel. Because, for example, if you compare Taiwan to, say, the United States or mainland China, firms in China have been given increasing access to data by the government in Beijing, but the data itself, in my view at least, is of comparatively low quality. In the United States, firms have tended to have poor access, but the data is high quality. And so if Taiwan can distinguish itself from both China and the United States by marrying these two pillars of both high quality and easy access for non-sensitive public sector data sets, it would be a unique comparative advantage for Taiwan's ecosystem. Sixth and seventh, finally, and then I'll wrap, following international regulatory policy best practices. For instance, Taiwan has joined the APEC cross-border privacy rules system for privacy and data transfer. And so it could continue to uphold its own privacy standards and potentially aim to seek a so-called adequacy decision, which is an EU determination that a party outside the EU offers an adequate level of data protection to meet tests under Europe's GDPR system. All right, and then finally, frankly, becoming more active in the global standard setting conversation, particularly on technology standards. For instance, by participating in international standard setting working groups on issues like cyber, Internet of Things, other emerging technologies, where Taiwan could actively help to drive the conversation around future standards. And there are a dozen more ideas in that report, and we can talk about any of those, especially around mirroring some elements of the Israeli experience, where they've married specialization to global advantage in niche sectors like cyber, which I think actually offers an interesting model for Taiwan. The bottom line is this: I very much hope the US and Taiwan move toward a bilateral trade agreement. I think it's possible now in a way that was not thinkable even 12 months ago. There's a lot of bipartisan support for that here in the United States. But the future lies not just in pork chops, but in innovation. And so by freeing up access to its very talented, well-organized, creative, and educated population, Taiwan will in time become, I think, a very attractive investment, innovation, and testing hub, even more than it is today, for a much greater variety of American international partners. I think that's important to encourage. I think if you look 10 to 20 years down the road rather than just 10 to 20 weeks down the road, that becomes especially important, and there's no time like now. So assuring Taiwan's innovation future, I think, is the central challenge ahead. Let me stop there, and I hope that gives you something to chew on.
Thank you, Professor Evan, for your distinguished views. It's about how to help Taiwan define its role in the post-COVID-19 era. And also for your information, 80% of Taiwan's exports actually intermediate goods, parts and components, meaning that Taiwan has been deeply integrated into the supply value chain, and to fit itself, to position itself into the future GVC is very important. And he shared his views to help Taiwan how to deal with the future challenges and also opportunities. And also, U.S.-Taiwan partnership is very important because normally we know that 40% of Taiwan's export heading for China. But however, the most export origins actually from the United States. So U.S. is indeed the Taiwan's major market. So the partnership is very crucial. So thank you for your suggestion and the excellent views. Next, let me invite Professor Kanahara Sensei. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Evan, for your comprehensive and very rich presentation. I would like to start to commend the Taiwan government and Taiwan people for successful management of COVID situation, maybe the best in Asia. But I want to also commend the great success of Taiwan in participating in building the liberal order in Asia. It's emerging, simply didn't exist before. Homeland of liberalism, United States and the Great Britain, Europe, they are saying that they are at disruption of liberal order. But we are now talking about we are at creation of liberal order. The 1990s, 1980s, many Asian nations started to democratize. Before that, they had spectacular economic success. And in 1986, the Manila, Philippines, got democratized. And then 87 was Korea, and Li Dafei in Taiwan led Taiwan to democracy under Kuomintang. He was a great leader. Sorry that he passed away. But I have to say that this liberal international order is hard-won. It's earned by us, blood, sweat, and everything. Easiest part is industrialization. We can introduce Western money, technology, catch up with them. And then Japan's part is over. And then Taiwan, Singapore, Korea, Hong Kong came up. ASEAN nations came up. And China came up, coming up still, very big. Problem is the industrialization entails other problems. One is the nation changes. Nation becomes a nation state. You have to establish a new identity, modern identity as a nation. China is struggling for that. They are no longer Han's nation. They have Mongols, Koreans, and Tibetans, Uyghurs, many ethnic minorities that count 100 million still searching for their soul to see their identity. And the Communist Party has not yet successful in establishing a new identity of modern China. Biggest part is democratization. Industrial society can be run only by democracy, and they are not yet there. Unfortunately, China succeeded in industrialization. Now China is 3 times bigger than us, than Japan, and China is now 70% of the United States. And under new normal situation, the growth rate is between maybe 6.5%, they say, but it's not true. Could be 3 or 4%, but still growing. China might reach US size. They will never reach Japan US size. They can never reach Japan, US, Europe, and other developed nation size. That means we can somehow still engage China, not by goodwill, but by our persuasion with strength. And in this perspective, technology, science, technology is very important. I have to point 3 risks here. The one is the military technology edge. We have to keep it. If we lose that, we're going to lose control of the situation. And China is catching up with us very quickly. I have to say, on civil sector, the military sector, the affairs are totally different today. The situation is very, very different. Warfare today is very different from the Pacific War, the Korean War. Today we have cyberspace, we have space, and we have, of course, Navy and ground forces, Air Force, US Marines. These 3-4 components of the military forces are combined by telecommunications through the cyberspace, and all the assets in the space, GPS assets, recon assets, and everything, they are connected by cyberspace. Huge amount of data is circulating inside the military people, and they became one. They can see everything from everywhere, and they can attack anybody from anywhere. That's new forces. It's one big mega Godzilla. That's new forces. Americans is leading the situation. China is following Americans. Russians are not very good, but we're trying to catch up with the American forces. The cyber is very important because everything is connected by cyberspace. If cyberspace is say complicated, everything is lost. We're gonna lose any signals, communications from the space. All the 3 components are separated, and they have to be blinded. They have to fight in the darkness. So we have to keep the technological edge in the military affairs that gives us cognitive information superiority, that gives us a superiority in the air, at the sea, on the grounds, and in the space. And for that, the cyberspace is very important. But we cannot lose technological edge to managing the cyberspace. I have to say, money is important. The Pentagon has the $800 billion budget. It's huge, isn't it? It's 1% of world GNP. World GNP, 1% is spent by Pentagon. And roughly 15% of that money goes to research and development. That's the reason why the Pentagon was leading not only militarily, but also the civil technology globally. Internet is born from Pentagon. And this was the situation, but unfortunately, 10 years ago, the biggest companies on earth was half our Japanese banks, half our American petroleum companies. Today, it's totally dominated by the net companies, platforms, GAFA and BATs. Half are Chinese, half are Americans. Sorry, but Japanese and Europeans are out from this competition. And they have a huge amount of money, and they are developing into the next phase. 5G is more part, 6G, but quantum is coming soon. That drastically change again the whole picture. We are in the science technology competition, and whosoever wins this race wins the globe. This is where we are. And second, the risk is the cyberspace intelligence. Again, the intelligence has changed totally like warfare. Before, the good spy was like a burglar of a diamond, open up the safe and pick up a big diamond. That was a spy, say, 50 years ago. Today, they're like a vacuum cleaner. They absorb everything. The algorithm, AI, picks up everything, and they make an analysis here, deep analysis, and comes up with the analyzed data. And this is new intelligence. The huge amount of data is necessary. Anything is okay, data is okay. So data must be protected. And this is a new second risk. The third is the cyber attack in contingency. There could be malware everywhere and implanted. There's absolutely no totally independent network. Network must be updated, repaired, and sometimes connected with the outer cyberspace. And if cyberspace is down, nation is down, that could pull down the power generator and then the industrial complex, military facilities. So we have to keep a clean network. So we have to think of 3 levels. One is platform. Platform is dominated by the Americans and Chinese. The thing is, China does not allow Western platforms to operate inside their market. So they're outside the market. On the contrary, Chinese platforms are free to operate in Western cyberspace. The typical one is TikTok. It's hugely popular, not very much in Japan, but hugely popular in the United States. And all data there, names, birth dates, birthplace, even locations, could be sent to server. And there's no guarantee that this information does not go to Beijing. And Chinese Communist Party has a legal authority to absorb any private information inside of China. And they can order legally to submit all they have as data. So the platform must be clean. This is one. Second, network. Say we have deep sea cables are dominated by Americans, Japanese, and French. Still, Huawei is coming in. And I have to say that the Chinese telecommunication companies, they have good codes, but key to the code, to break code, there's no guarantee neither that the Communist Party does not have it. They might have it, they must have it. So they can read anything, coded information inside the Chinese network. And this is the case. And 5G is now a big issue everywhere. And we have to pay attention to digital transformation. It's not only about smartphone. Now, Apple Watch, sensor cameras, everything is now with the sensors connected to the localizations of 5G network. This is digital transformation age. The Internet of Things is coming in very soon. Oh, it's coming in already. And if we invite, there are only 3 black boxes, you have to choose one. Huawei, Nokia, or Ericsson. You can't decompose it, you have to buy one. And if you buy Huawei, you have to live with it forever. And this is the 5G question. And we said maybe zero risk because we might have some difficult situation here in Asia. And Americans the same, and Europeans and the Australians the same. Europeans, they see only Putin. They don't see Xi Jinping. They were somehow okay, relaxed. But Americans are now saying, no, side is very different. It's very dangerous. And the UK finally agreed to eliminate Huawei from their 5G system. A network must be clean. They can be used for cyber intelligence, and they can be used for destruction at the time of contingency. The third is semiconductor. This is another bigger dimension, because semiconductors everywhere. In 1990s, semiconductors were only produced by Americans and Japanese, and we're winning the race. Americans are very angry. We had a deal because the Americans cannot accept that. All these semiconductors used in Pentagon, in the civil sector and the military sector, are dominated by Japanese. They cannot accept it. So with a deal, But when the Cold War is over, this this sense of threat is over. It's evaporated. And now we see Japanese and Americans transfer all the production to the Taiwanese, to the Koreans, and to the Chinese. Producers are only these three nations. And when the China is starting to be a bit different strategically, they are taking different position. They were with us before to face the Russians, and now they are joining Russians or replacing Russians. And it's a big mistake for Xi Jinping, but for some moments, they could be in that direction. Then we cannot accept any risk. And that's the reason why we need a clean semiconductor. And there, the TSMC, they lost 15% of their production sale to the Huawei, and they chose the United States. New factories now being built in Arizona. I think this is a great contribution. Finally, I have to say that the Trump administration's this kind of regulation policy of technology flow to China is somehow, they have merits. But I have to say, the key issue is coordination among the allies and the friends. And the Europeans, we are okay with Abe-san, but Abe-san is quitting. It's a big problem for us. But the Americans need to re-establish the leadership, because it's only Americans who can lead the Europeans, Japanese, and Taiwanese. We have to have a more transparent, we have to have a more systematic approach among the West. The whole Western economic size, including G7 nations, except China, it's more than 50% of world GNP. China is 16%. They can never dominate us. When we are somehow realigned, united, we can still, I'm hopeful, we can still frame Chinese strategic direction. We cannot afford China repeating the history of Imperial Japan. That's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kanahara. I think I forget to introduce you, right? Professor Nabukazu Kanehara, he is a professor of the Law Department of Political Science, Doshisha University. And Professor raised a very important point because besides the COVID, the tech war and battle for the leadership of 5G will also reshape the future GVC. And also he mentioned about the semiconductor. That is actually very important and the most critical industry for Taiwan. And so I believe that Taiwan should continue to work closely with its allies like Japan, Korea, and the United States to move up supply value chain and to secure its competitive advantage. So thank you, Professor. Our next presenter is Professor Yong Koo Yoon, who is a representative J Campus, Emeritus Professor, University of Yonsei. So Professor Yong, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Topics of our panel are very diverse. The first speaker talk about the Taiwan's innovation system. Second speaker talk about the cyber and military security. And I'm going to discuss the COVID-19 and its impact on global value chains. And I'd like to make 4 points. First, global value chain or a global network of production and distribution of products and services has been weakened or adversely affected since 2008 for various reasons, especially since 2018, when the United States still attempting to decouple our economy from China. Second, the COVID-19 has revealed the vulnerability of many countries and companies that they found out they depend on manufactured products made in China. So some countries are beginning to provide incentives for their companies, their national and foreign companies, to come back to home, so-called reshoring, but I'll argue that there are clear limits to the reshoring for various reasons. Third point, I'd like to propose that the global value chain will be partly replaced by regional value chains, especially three major regional value chains centered on the US, China, and Germany. And among three, the East Asian value chain will be the biggest of the three and probably the future backbone of global production network. Fourth, the East Asian value chain will be based on the corridor from China to ASEAN, with three additional players in Northeast Asia, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, joining as investors and suppliers of parts and components. Those are 4 points I'd like to make, and let me elaborate my points a little bit in more detail. Global value chain or network of global production and supply has developed since the early 1970s. So-called offshoring started as early as the 1970s, began to full bloom with the entry of China into international trade, especially development of IT products such as PCs in the 1990s. So the global value chain had the best years between 1990 to 2010. But around 2008, GVC had some slowdown. So several factors contributed to the slowdown or decline of the global division of labor and production. Number one is, of course, increasing protectionism from the recession starting in 2008. Second, a relative shift of production factors from labor to knowledge. Third, development of service industry. Fourth, the maturity and competence of China's manufacturing sector. China started as assembler in the early industrialization, but became a fully integrated manufacturing country around 2012 or 13. And China became less dependent on foreign parts and components, especially supplied from Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. So this China becoming a fully integrated manufacturing country made China less dependent on cross-border division of production. Then came the trade war between the U.S. and China in 2018, and global value chain further deteriorated with the trade war between U.S. and China. And the breakout of COVID-19 is likely to further accelerate a downward trend of global value chain to a certain degree. The COVID-19 revealed the world's dependence on manufactured products made in China. The United States found she was importing all kinds of products from China, from simple products like face masks to more sophisticated medical equipment. So the old so-called security argument of protectionism suddenly found legitimacy and sympathizers in many countries. Several countries tried to secure a certain minimum percentage of products to be made at home, and other countries began to provide various incentives to their national companies to come back home, so-called reshoring, pressuring those companies to come back home, and then, and some companies like Apple was trying to reduce its dependence on China and relocate some of its production to Southeast Asia or India. But it's not so easy for overseas manufacturing companies or plants to come home. First of all, it takes time to build plant and add production capacity at home. And home plant requires availability of skilled or semi-skilled workers and supply of parts and components, which takes time. And even if the plants are constructed, production costs at advanced economies are much higher than those in developing countries. So because of the cost and supply concerns, coming home could stop at nearby countries such as Mexico for the US or Poland or some other Eastern European countries for Germany. Thus, instead of reshoring, many companies come back to nearby countries, so the term nearshoring is used. On top of that, China's domestic market is either number one or number two in size, depending on products, and very few MNEs ready to give up China market. In fact, the American Chamber of Commerce survey shows I think 80 to 85% of American companies plan to stay in China despite pressures from US government. So although there are pressures on American and other foreign companies to rely less on China's manufacturing, but it will prove to be very difficult for them to relocate their production elsewhere. Thus, I'd like to suggest that global value chain will be replaced by not national value chain, but regional value chains. In the context of Asia, it means some of production will move from China to ASEAN. For sure, some of production will come back home. For example, for Japanese and Taiwanese companies, there are signs that some of the Japanese and Taiwanese companies are coming back home, partly thanks to various incentives provided by respective governments. In case of Korea, domestic production cost is very high due to increased minimum wages and difficulties arising from the inflexible labor market. And Korean companies are moving in great numbers to ASEAN countries, especially Vietnam. And even some Chinese manufacturing companies are relocating their plants to ASEAN because of rising production costs and relative shortage of workers at home. And of course, some American and European companies are also shifting some of their China production to ASEAN region. So in short, global value chain will be partly replaced by regional value chains, especially three main ones in North America, the European Union, and East Asia. The East Asian value chain, or EAVC, I like to call it EAVC, will be the biggest of all three due to the long tradition of East Asia being a favorable outsourcing destination starting in the 1970s. Although labor costs are not as important as it used to be, still it plays a role. And in ASEAN, for example, there are 4 new member countries, sometimes called CLMV, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam, who provide low wages. And the ASEAN market itself is growing very fast, and also ASEAN has added advantage of being near India or being a corridor between Northeast Asia and India. So the future East Asia value chain will, I think, thrive on the China-ASEAN axis. And 3 northeastern economies, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan will join as suppliers of parts and components and materials to the ASEAN assembly operations for the time being. So my key point is the COVID-19 is likely to disrupt existing network of global division of labor in production and supply to a certain extent, but it cannot completely alter the fundamental strengths of the global value chain, which is low cost, efficiency, and productivity. Although China will still be a dominant player in global and regional manufacturing, there will be enough rooms for other players like Taiwan, Korea, or Japan in the newly emerging East Asia value chain, especially in the rapidly growing ASEAN region in the future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Zhong. Professor Zhong pointed out a very important event, that is the emergence of East Asia value chain. And I think the regional value chain indeed deserve our greater attention, especially we are all part of it. This very important production network, or we could call it production sharing. And also, for your information, the homecoming Taiwanese businesses, outbound investors originally operating in China, coming back to Taiwan, actually support Taiwan's economic growth since last year. And this year also contribute to significantly to our Taiwan's capital investment. Okay, so thank you, Professor. And let me invite our next presenter, the last but certainly not the least, Director Ho-Suk Lee Makiyama. Director Ho-Suk is the director of the European Center for International Political Economy. So, Director, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Director Chu. It's a pleasure to join you today, and I will try to touch upon all the topics that have been raised by Evan, Professor Jung, and also Professor Kanehara. But first of all, I would like to start where our chair started a conversation around the post-COVID recovery and the world economic outlook, because I think the situation really frames the topic of economic security, because in the end, the policy options and the policy space in regards to what can actually be done in economic policy is extremely limited. And I would argue that it has never been this limited for any executive in Taiwan or United States or Europe at this stage. Because in the end, I think, as Director Chu was pointing out, that the world economic outlook is pretty grim, and it's probably much worse than it looks. And IMF has downgraded the GDP projections for the world global economy several times. And as we look, we are looking at a contraction of 5% of global GDP, which is actually 7% lower than we predicted it would be by January 2020. The most important point is to remember from what this actually means for a non-economist is that the world economic output has wiped out $6 trillion from the global economy. How much is $6 trillion? It's 10 Taiwans. And for a man who doesn't think that we can lose even one Taiwan, 10 Taiwan is a pretty big deal. And just to put things in context, I think also it is right to say that Taiwan's economy has managed relatively well, and it's actually even expected to grow this year, which not many countries can say. And but it is still a downgrading of the previous forecasts that has occurred. And if you compare it to where I am in the Eurozone, we are looking at a drop of minus 10%. And this is probably the worst economic downgrade that we have experienced in this for the last 100 years. And I would like to point out that recovery is yet to come with so many uncertainties. We are looking at second and third waves in many countries, and also we are looking at secondary impact on equity markets. So when we are talking about global GDP, we are not actually talking about assets. So the asset markets can still take a crunch. And what's also worrying me quite a bit is that the COVID-19 has so far affected relatively resourceful economies, and the impact on emerging markets like Brazil and India, where social distancing is really not possible, could still lead to a severe debt crunch, which could affect the global markets. And in the context of international trade, that is so important for the economic security, where the conversation is centered around the importance of not just supply chain, but global economic governance. It is quite apparent that we are going to see much more disproportionate drop, and which is bigger than the GDP drop. So we are looking at least 12% with severe demand contraction all over the world. And not just by demand contraction where people spend less, but also because of transport network has been down for a pretty significant production hubs around the world, and supply chains, of course. And we need to bear in mind that this is going to be living with us for a long time. And trade is actually declining against a relatively low benchmark. And just to give you a proportion of how long this will stay with us, the global trade contraction we saw in the global financial crisis and the euro crisis of 2008 and 2010 was something where we could still see the impact until last year. So it took us a good decade to recover from a very much more smaller trade crisis. And since Professor Young has already been talking about the impact on the value chains, I fully concur with that analysis. I will just add that 2021 will not be a year of recovery, but a very slow return to previous level of economic activity, where the first sign of political impact on the post-COVID response will be visible. Because I'd like to point out that in the trading system, as well as in our economic policy, what we have seen that everywhere COVID-19 goes, it has posed problems that are unique to each nation, since pandemic actually seems to amplify pre-existing problems. And I don't think neither Taiwan or Asia-Pacific region is really an exception. And the truth is that no country, not even Taiwan, was well equipped for a trade shock of a pandemic of today's scale. No one could have been. And no one had this kind of reserves that would be necessary in order to deal with a crisis of this kind. And in order to address these problems and the pre-existing problems, we have seen worsening of actually some of the pre-existing problems as well, because we have seen racking up debt to GDP ratio in so many OECD countries, and which has further eliminated the fiscal policy space. We have less money to throw at other things, and in where I am right now, we have descended once again into a political crisis, and I would even argue descending into a fratricide. France went as far as seizing medical equipment en route to Italian hospitals. And in some ways, and when we see a major crisis like this, our worst instincts to come out, and the thin veneer civilization seems to be washed out. And most importantly of this, at least from the conversation I'm following, is the over-reliance on mainland Chinese production capabilities and demand has been visible as one of the major pre-existing problems. And this is actually married with another factor that COVID and the current economic climate is unleashing, which is that trade-led growth will not be back on the table for a very long time. which means that an export-led growth or recovery is not going to be on the table, which put a major challenge for an economy like Taiwan or Germany. It doesn't really matter how well we are doing and how well we have managed our public health challenges. If our major demand markets are actually contracting, it is going to change our GDP and as well as our dependencies as well. And I think Taiwan's export rate is extremely well known. But also, if you look at some of the countries that we don't see as export-led, very much so, for example, in Europe, even countries like France, and Italy, and Spain have an export GDP ratio of over 30%, which should be compared to less than 20% for PRC, United States, and Japan. So we have seen a few different responses because, as I said, COVID has only amplified existing problems. And the first market response is diversification. And diversification can mean very different things. In some case, it could be offshoring. Other cases, actually onshoring back to home markets. And several early market signals seem to suggest that actually investments and production capabilities are moving back to PRC, at least from Europe, but also from United States and other areas. And because in the end, this is understandable because PRC was the first to go into the dark tunnel of COVID, and it was also one of the first major markets to come out of the tunnel. And if you listen to some of the investment calls that has been going on in the last 2 quarters, you see both responses. Onshoring back to the home markets as well as offshoring. And in short, I think the primary policy responses we are seeing now in terms of stimulus packages, most notably United States and Japan, that's one path. You also see a different path, which is import substitution and industrial restructuring, which you have primarily seen in Europe and the emerging economies. And we have also seen new attempts to, for example, never waste a good crisis. Greening of the economy has now become a way of conducting industrial restructuring. And in other words, more money thrown at a problem that was pre-existing. And I think Taiwan and the EU has a common challenge regarding the mainland. And I would argue that our relationship with PRC will be redefined in the coming 700 days, but perhaps in a couple of different stages. As I said, the PRC market is the first to come out of the tunnel, and where we see a 10% GDP growth already in the second quarter. We can have doubts about whether these numbers are correct, as much of the signals we see on the mainland market. But it is true that the first initial market and business response has been intensified activity into markets where there are still pockets of growth. And it's completely understandable, and it's completely also consumer-driven in order to improve the annualized company results of our businesses. But however, this also raises a major policy problem, not just a business problem, which is that European dependency and US dependency on mainland consumer business demand is already very strong, and it's bound to increase. And this is happening despite the attempts at decoupling of strategic sovereignty and continuing bifurcation, although we are seeing the pricing of macro political risks. And of course, we are fighting against a very difficult tide, and I think some of the initiatives, for example, what we are seeing in Japan, this supply chain security strategy is also grossly misunderstood. It's not a onshoring strategy that Prime Minister Abe has been engaged on. It's actually a diversification strategy. It's not about bringing business back to Japan, but also, but actually could go to ASEAN or other alternatives, and hopefully also Taiwan. And this kind of strategy is something that we have not yet seen in the major economies, because it's very much defined out from a political as well as economic current account. And one point that I would like to bring into the conversation here is that in this current phase of redefining a relationship and issues with PRC, we are also engaged in a investment negotiation over a bilateral investment treaty. And what we can see very clearly is that EU 27 as well as the United States is currently ramping up negotiation leverage against the PRC. We have introduced new EU investment screening and state aid disciplines, which are directly aimed at PRC enterprises. And we have also seen restrictions on 5G and Huawei in the radio access networks. I would assume that before the end of the year, 20 out of 27 EU member states will impose some kind of a restriction on Huawei and other high-risk vendors, including a designation of PRC companies as high-risk vendors. We are also looking at privacy investigation of mainland-owned business, and we have heard about TikTok. I believe it was Professor Kanehara who mentioned TikTok. Yes, it's facing an investment screening or actually a divestment requirement in the United States because investment is the main discipline to achieve these results. For just to show a balance in Europe, it's actually primarily privacy. Evan correctly pointed out also the importance of GDPR in the overall innovation structure. So we are probably going to look at maybe not TikTok, but other companies, not even Huawei, but other businesses who are abusing potential global accords on privacy, which will be Europe's way of dealing with the problem. And I would just add here that although I don't want to talk too much about Europe, it is very clear that the EU as well as ASEAN countries who are really the countries on the fence who could come down either way, either with the aligning with a Western liberal democracy on one hand or prioritizing economic links with PRC. But Europe is a particular problem because security is not an EU competence. We have just cooperated even within the EU countries. We very rarely cooperate externally. UK has left the EU, and the UK was the only member of the Five Eyes intelligence cooperation, and none of the EU countries actually have a major insight in the Pacific region in terms of the security parameters. So that means that the cooperation on 5G is actually extremely important coordination for us. And I'll come back to the question about semiconductors and lithography equipment if there is any interest. But if the first stage is actually more investment going into where there is growth, the second stage is going to be defined by these hostilities between EU and mainland. And because PRC planners are unlikely to open up to Europe and other markets than the United States, and Beijing's response will be determined by the condition of the pre-existing problems they had, which is negative current deficit with more money leaving mainland economy than coming into it. That basically means that the relationship of the major investment capital, which is currently not United States but Europe, is going to move towards a much more hostile direction. And especially if mainland economy opens up according to US interests and priorities, and EU and US and actually Japan has very, very different priorities in terms of sectors. So in conclusion, I think the post-COVID supply chain response of the system is more demand diversification rather than supply chain diversification in the first step. But it's posed, as I said, a major problem for Taiwan and countries like Germany because we could never support the industrial utilization rates that we used to have in the past. That basically means some form of industrial restructuring or searching for major markets. I believe Taiwan will do well in this transition to find new markets. But the problem is if you have a major bloc, for example, like Europe where I am, there are no new major markets. Unless we seek out another big planet, another civilization in the galaxy, we are the biggest economy in the world. So therefore, there are no new FTAs that we can do. ASEAN is politically blocked. India doesn't look like it's opening up. The transatlantic relations are currently at its worst, and it has very little to do with Donald Trump. So that basically means that we are probably looking at the worst case, a grand bargaining between PRC and Europe in the coming 5 to 10 years. This is, of course, as I said, it limits our policy space, and it also imposes new challenges for us who wants to improve Taiwan-EU relationship. And in the investment agreement I mentioned before, there's of course a parallel investment negotiation between Taiwan and EU. And I think it was the previous panel who talked very much about PRC should have no say about which countries that can join CPTPP. I believe it was Charles who mentioned this. And similarly, no one should have a say about which WTO member EU has the right to conduct trade agreements or investment agreements with. But unfortunately, the Finlandization of EU trade policy is quite complete when it comes to along the 9-dash line. The fear of PRC is pretty dominant, and the risk of angering China. And as someone who has been growing up in the shadow of China for many decades, I would jokingly tell my European colleagues that anger is a normal state of PRC, so it's nothing really to worry about. But the second question that also comes to my mind from perspective of Brussels is that we are now in the process of updating the trade strategy of 2015. And it was very clearly stated in the previous strategy that we should try to attempt a negotiation with Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau. And now that the agreement with Hong Kong and Macau is probably looking as a political impossibility. That means that we need to single out Taiwan directly. We don't no longer have pretext. And finally, one thing that I will warn is that outside of United States, which is more or less like PRC, a revisionist power, the most executives in the trade and economic policy have a very strong preference for the status quo, the multilateral order, rule-based order, and which basically means that any change will come at a significant cost. And these are just some of the challenges I see in improving relationship with Taiwan in the future. Of course, we continue to work towards the direction of improving the relationship with our friends, and I believe it is extremely important in a world we can't even afford to lose one by one. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Ho-Suk. Thank you for bringing up the relationship in the future between Taiwan and EU. Of course, EU and United States both are very, very important markets for final products. And also Taiwan's export in total of, I think, 9% heading for Europe. And you mentioned about the China factor. It seems like everywhere, and it will be interesting to see its role, especially in the post-COVID era. And also, I fully agree with you that of course, so far, Taiwan's economy has been doing quite well, but it is very challenging to actually immune from this very significant external shock because for the past 10 years, the coefficient correlation between Taiwan's economic growth and the world growth, standing at 93%. So thank you again, Director Ho-Suk. And now we have 10 minutes. We have 10 minutes for Q&A, and the floor is open. Please identify yourself and make your question concise. Thank you. Yeah, the gentleman.
My name is Bill Sharp. I'm a visiting scholar at National Taiwan University and a Taiwan Fellow. I'd like to address this question to Professor Feigenbaum. You talked about the successes of Taiwan's Asia Silicon Valley, or at least relative successes. I wonder, when in terms of innovation, how would you assess the progress of the other components of the 5+2 Innovative Industrial Development Program?
Okay, Professor Feigenbaum, you want to answer that question? Let's take one question and at one. Yeah, later. Okay. Yeah, Professor Feigenbaum. Yeah, the floor is yours.
I think it's been a mixed bag, frankly, but I think directionally it's heading in the right direction. And I think the problem, as I said, is that some of the architectural investments that need to be put in place have been either too slow or lacking. And I think part of the challenge is to make Taiwan a more attractive investment destination and to build out that architecture in some of the ways that I talked about. But I'm not especially critical of it because I think the identification of the sectors has, broadly speaking, been correct. And I think in some of the areas there are going to be new opportunities, frankly, because of some of what we're talking about here. It's not just supply chain shift. If you look at what Nobu said about data-intensive industries, it just seems to me that Taiwan has an advantage as people begin to think beyond mainland China because of some of these issues too, as I said, leverage open access to data in new ways.
So thank you. Did I answer your question? Okay, lady over there, yeah. Someone hand the microphone.
Can I just start?
No.
Yeah. I've got a question for Dr. Feigenbaum. This is Jane Rickards from The Economist in Taipei. You were talking about how so many Taiwanese foreign students in the US don't return home. From my perspective in Taiwan, it seems like that Taiwan has a problem of seriously stagnating salaries. Do you think that the Tsai administration is doing everything it can to sort of stimulate wage growth? For example, it's raised the minimum wage a few times. Or are there any more specific measures the government could take to raise wages? Because I think that's I don't know whether that's what you think, but I think the key reason why they're not returning home is the wage differential. Thanks.
So this
That
question
that may be a question best directed to our moderator.
So who do you want to answer your question?
Sorry, you said it was a question best directed at who, sorry?
Directed to
I think
who?
at our moderator.
Oh, right, the
Me?
moderator, yes.
Can we talk about this after this session?
Sure, no worries.
Okay, in person. And lady here, yeah. I know you have a question, yeah.
Thank you so much. My name is Zsuzsa Ferenci, and I am a Taiwan Fellow based here at Academia Sinica. And I am also, I've worked for 12 years in the European Parliament, so I'm very happy to see a view from Brussels, but from a different perspective. As I was inside the European Parliament, I'm always interested in listening to other views from the outside, from the think tank world. So I have a question to Dr. Ho-Suk Lee Makiyama concerning you said one thing that I think, I'm just looking, yes, the EU needs to single out Taiwan directly. And I would like to have your assessment of this new geopolitical commission we have in place, how realistic this is in your opinion, and how you see member states dealing with such a perspective as you put forward. Do you think that there is really an opening in Brussels, in the institutions, and how do you see the fragmentations between the member states affecting this, and how realistic you think this is?
Okay, thank you for your question. Director Ho-Suk, you have the floor. Director Hosuk, can you hear me?
Thank you so much. Yes, I was muted by mistake. Thank you so much for the question, Susanna, and it's nice to see you in Taipei. I will directly answer the question as blunt as I can, which is that I believe, my personal belief is that it wasn't for the politicization, we would have a free trade agreement with Taiwan already. Not just an investment agreement, but a full-scale trade agreement, including tariffs. Because in the end, both Taiwan and Europe is mainly interested in exporting, not necessarily investment. And also, to be very, very blunt, in a democratic rule-based order like in Taiwan, we don't face any investment barriers that are significant that we can't work our way around. And so, in other words, I think we can only attribute the lack of a trade agreement post EU-Korea and EU-Japan to the political factor. We see less of the Finlandization of EU trade policy. The recent development where Czech Republic of all countries have actually taken the first step is very welcoming. And I think also most of all, the mistakes that have been made on a diplomatic level from a PRC has actually encouraged us to take a stronger stand. This is no longer just a question about Taiwan. This is actually about our sovereignty and our autonomy in being able to engage economic discussions with WTO members. I would connect this to the previous question from the audience question from the economists. There is a way to actually improve the attractiveness of wages. I make a point of not making too strong comments about domestic policies of our allied countries like Taiwan, but as an independent economist, it is clear that the wages are part of the problem because suppressing wages also suppress consumption. And with less domestic consumption, you become a less attractive trading partner. So in other words, actually improving wages will have a huge boost on consumption, which will actually strengthen Taiwan's negotiation position in engaging and liberalizing trade on a bilateral or trilateral context.
Thank you, Dr. Hosuk. I think we have time for 2 more questions. So anyone? No? Okay. Because we probably have 3 more minutes, so let me invite each panelist to each to give a 30 seconds conclusion regarding your presentation. Let me start with Professor Evan Falkenbaum. Professor?
Well, I just reiterate my core theme. I think the opportunities for Taiwan are considerable. I think innovation is largely the future. And I think part of the challenge of innovation, as I said, is keeping pace with technological change. That's not just about government policy. It's about educational investments, what one might call industrial policy, international partnerships. And I think also transitioning beyond some of these legacy industries into some of these new ones. So I really think that very much is at the core of the challenge. But it's one that the government seems serious about facing down. And I think particularly given the turbulence in supply chains and beyond, there will be opportunities, as I said, for Taiwan to be what I called a trusted tester, vendor, conduit, and so on, that really ought to be seized now. Because I think if you fast forward 2 to 3 years down the road, it'll be much harder to make those investments. Mainland China will be in a different position than it is today. Frankly, the US-China relationship may be in a different position than it is today. It's not something that we got into in great detail. But there's no time like now for those investments. And I think both for Taiwan, for the United States, and for Taiwan and for other international partnerships, that's really at the core of the challenge.
Thank you, Professor. I guarantee you Taiwan is very trustworthy indeed. Next, Kanehara Sensei.
Well, thank you very much thank you for having me today. Taiwan is very important for Japan and for everybody here in the region, and its importance is felt more and more by everybody in the region. 23 million population. It's maybe seventh biggest nation if it is in Europe, and the economy was great success, and it's a vibrant democracy today, and we have to think about Taiwan's breathing space in Asia. COVID prompted us to think about truly why you are not so active in the WHO. We should think about Taiwan more seriously. And in that context, I have to say that including Taiwan, all the other industrial nations in Asia or industrializing nations in Asia should have a common strategy under the leadership of, I have to say, Washington. That is somehow difficult today. And China is not like Soviet Union. They were with us, and our supply chains are deeply inside. Not platforms, but manufacturers are deeply inside of China. And decoupling is not an easy issue, but we have to think about it, where to decouple, where to be coupled still. And this is a difficult strategy, and we have to talk about this issue, including Taiwan. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Our next presenter, Dr. Yong. Dr. Yong, 30 seconds, please.
Well, I'd like to just make a comment about salaries and wages in Taiwan. I think 3 years ago, I found out that the fresh college graduate salary Taiwan is about 1/3 of Korean college graduates. And the per capita income, both in terms of the PPP or otherwise, very similar, around 35,000. So I was wondering, given the similar per capita income, why Taiwan college engineering graduate salary is only 1/3 of Korea's. And I found out two reasons. Number one is the labor union. We have a very effective labor union in this country, very strong labor union. And another is the oligopoly market structure in Korea. But I'm thinking that somebody mentioned, maybe Evan mentioned that Taiwan PhDs from the US don't return to Taiwan. Not as many as they used to. Maybe is it possible that Taiwan companies have their R&D operations in Silicon Valley or the US, so Taiwan companies can retain or take advantage of Taiwan graduates in the US instead of bringing them home? Is it possible? Maybe this is a question to Evan.
So, Professor Evan, you want to take that question? Professor Evan, I cannot hear you. You have to turn on the mic.
I said I think it's possible, but I think innovation in Taiwan ought to be the goal. If I were sitting in Taipei, to make Taiwan a center of innovation and a hub for it, rather than to export my most innovative talent overseas. But that's a subject, we could have a whole other panel on that subject. It'd be very interesting.
Thank you. And also he mentioned about the GDP per capita PPP. I think that's because the Central Bank of Taiwan has been doing a good job, I think. Okay, our next Dr. Hong Suk, you have 30 seconds.
Thank you so much. Time is a relative concept, and I probably overstayed my welcome already, so I'm very grateful for the 30 seconds. I'll just make a couple of points. One is that I think the takeaway of this is that geoeconomic risks are going to call for not repatriation, but diversification. And that basically means that Taiwan is a prime destination, exactly for the reason that Evan has pointed out. But I would like to warn here that fear of over-reliance on PRC and fear of PRC itself, as Professor Kanehara has clearly pointed out, is not necessarily the same as the love for Taiwan. And the power and the attraction of the Taiwan and the Taiwanese people and the Taiwanese market and its importance is actually slightly distinct from the question about the need for diversification. And the third point I will make here is that the current economic setup and the security problem that it has also raised at the same time, like a perfect tsunami, is going to call for very difficult domestic transitions. And we talked now, I mean, the question about wages, I think, was quite timely in a sense, because in the end, we are looking at many transitions of this kind on domestic and transitioning from an export-led model to domestic demand is going to be extremely difficult, not just for Taiwan, but also for Europe. And transition always come at a very, very high political cost. That means that there is a very strong preference in the executive branch for status quo. And preserving status quo will necessitate a number of actions. And I hope that people will understand that actually we need to, in order to preserve the status quo in our economic relationship with Taiwan, means that we need to upgrade the relationship we have with Taiwan. Otherwise, we cannot even maintain this current level of engagement and intensity of our trade and investment between Taiwan and the world community. So in order to preserve, because of these transitions, I think it's going to be even more important to engage with Taiwan even further. And I hope that can be a part of that process. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Ho-Suk. I think time's up. We had a very wonderful session. And I want to thank our four excellent panelists to share their distinguished views regarding how to cope with the potential challenges and maybe even to seize the potential opportunities with respect to this unprecedented anomaly. This is a vivid example of a paradigm shift. So please join me to thank our panelists. Let's give them a big hand. And also thank you for your participation. Thank you. The session is closed.